Hey there, hi there, ho there, dear listeners. Welcome to Table to Stage. I'm Jordan Werma, and this is my podcast. So today's episode dug up a few fun connections between myself and my guest, including a previous guest of the show and a couple of mutual friends. Having so many connections with someone from such a distant and foreign place as Worcester, Massachusetts, am I pronouncing that right? It was rather surprising, and somehow I had no trouble understanding his strange foreign language. All right, anyway, Michael C. Bailey is the author of several series, including the young adult series Action Figures, the fantasy series Strongarm and Lightfoot, and his most recent Well-Behaved Women. We talked a little bit about all of them, but I was particularly drawn to the Strongarm and Lightfoot series as just actually earlier in the day, I had finished the first in the series, Scratching a Lich, in audiobook format, read by one of my earliest guests, Heather Auden. Now, for the recording, I did apply to travel to the land of Massachusetts, but my visa application was denied by the embassy, so we had to record remotely. Michael was a pleasure to speak with, so no more of this, we'll just get right to it.
Yeah, I'm a lifelong Massachusetts
Okay,
resident.
so you were born, raised in Massachusetts?
Yeah, originally from Falmouth down on Cape Cod, and over the years I've migrated to Worcester, which seems to be the center of New England. Everything is an hour away from Worcester. So.
Yeah. They say that about pretty much everything in Connecticut, too. You're only an hour away from just about anywhere, unless you get all the way over onto one side or the other. So what was your experience like growing up in Massachusetts? I mean, Cape Cod is a pretty unique place to be, but then Worcester, I think, is also a pretty unique place, as culturally speaking. It's really that really strong New England vibe there. So, did any of that influence you, growing up and realizing your creative potentials? Did your surroundings sort of rub off on you, or did you take anything specific away from the environment you were growing up in?
I don't know. Growing up on the Cape, I was a kid in the 70s and a teen in the 80s. And the only thing that really changed significantly in my neck of the woods at the time was how well you could afford to live there.
Yeah.
It was the age of starter mansions on the beach, and it drove a lot of people off Cape to more affordable areas, and eventually I was one of them, which is how I, in a roundabout way, ended up in Worcester. And I really haven't left New England very much in my lifetime. So if it has affected me on any level, I'm not really aware of it, just because I don't have too much context for comparison.
Okay.
The farthest away I've ever been from New England was a week out in Arizona, and the big difference there was it was hotter, drier, and there wasn't a conifer to be found anywhere. It was nothing but pink and beige as far as the eye can see.
Right, and one-story houses and
Everything's made of adobe.
Yeah, right. Pebble yards and cactuses. I've been to Arizona a couple times. I've enjoyed it, but it's not enough to draw me away from New England.
No, I need,
basis.
as much as the winters drive me crazy. I need to be around nature. I need to be within reasonable distance of the ocean. If I get too far away, I mean, Worcester is not anywhere near the water per se, but if I need to go back home and
Right.
recharge on native soil or native sand, as it were.
Oh, sure. So, when did you first discover an interest in writing? Was it a creative writing that was your first draw, or was it something else?
It was something else. My mother inadvertently got me hooked on comic books at a very young age.
Oh, okay.
I mean, the short form is she bought me a Spider-Man comic. I fell in love with the character and with the art form. And I decided when I was a really small child that I was going to grow up and be a comic book artist.
Okay.
So throughout my formative years, I drew obsessively. My mother would buy me these really cheap drawing pads, like 100 pages for $2. And I'd fill them within a day with my own comics and comic strips.
Your own creations, or you're using...
My own creations, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes I'd try my hand at the superheroes I enjoyed, but I did a lot of my own original stuff. And high school came around. I spent my time there, one, keeping my head down because I hated high school, and I also drew cartoons for the school newspaper. And I thought that the next step would be to try and get this going on a professional level, and I ended up going to the Joe Kubert School in New Jersey, which, for anyone who doesn't know, the late Joe Kubert, one of the greats of the Silver Age of comics, established this specifically to train comic book artists and animators. So I was there for about 2.5 years, which is really about 2 years too long. Well, I got there and I saw what other people were doing right out of the gate, and I thought maybe I was in the wrong place.
So we're talking like the late 80s or so here, early 90s?
Yeah, this would have been 88 through 90, 91.
Okay. So this is like right before the Todd McFarlane era of comic books then, right?
Yeah, we hadn't gotten quite into we were just getting into the grim and gritty phase of comic books. This was Dark Knight Returns.
Yeah.
Post Frank Miller Daredevil. Everything was kind of, the artwork was all kind of muddy. Everything was really violent, dark.
Right. A lot of jagged lines and
a lot of jagged lines. This wasn't. We hadn't gotten quite into cross-hatching mania with McFarlane, Jim Lee, Eric Larson, and that group.
So you were influenced by guys like Ditko, like that generation, or
a lot of my early influences. I was just kind of getting nostalgic about this the other day. The era of Spider-Man I was reading was John Romita Sr., Ross Andrew, Gil Kane. So that particular age of comics, the Buscema brothers, fairly young in the career, they were the ones really influencing me, and later influenced me on the action figures books, which I'm sure we'll talk about later.
Oh yeah, we'll get there.
John Byrne, Chris Claremont. So I had plenty of inspiration that I could not live up to. And it was halfway through my third and final year at the Kubert School that I actually went to Joe himself, who was very accessible. He taught classes himself, which was amazing.
Oh, that's a nice thing to have access to there.
Yeah. And he did me one of the biggest favors anyone has ever done for me, and he was brutally honest and said, your art's plateaued. I don't see you getting any better. I don't see you getting good enough to do this professionally. And instead of being crushed that this guy was telling me my lifelong dream was not going to happen, it was a relief. Because at that point, I felt on a gut level that was the case. But I needed to hear it from someone who was more objective about it and wouldn't tell me. He told me what I needed to hear, not what I wanted to hear.
Yeah.
But he also told me that he still thought that I had the passion for storytelling and I had the capacity. It just wasn't through art. And I figured, well, technically I've been kind of writing my own stuff for years, so maybe let's give that a try.
So had you been paying a lot of attention to story elements doing your own comic work, or were you focused mainly on the drawing aspect of it?
I was consciously focused on the drawing aspect of it, but I apparently picked up a lot of storytelling basics subconsciously because when I started out trying scripts because it was something I was a little more familiar with.
Yeah.
And I already knew on a instinctive level the 3-act structure, a lot of the basic rules for writing screenplays, things like, one page equals 1 minute of action. Don't introduce major characters in the 3rd act. Just a lot of things I picked up on, and when I actually decided to go for the writing thing in earnest and started doing a little research, I'd read these books on storytelling and script writing, and 9 times out of 10 I'd go, oh, I kind of knew this already.
Yeah. Now, when you got the news from Joe, what was your next move? How did you transition in your mind away from focusing on art, but picking up on that idea that maybe you can tell stories in other ways? How did you channel that?
I basically just started writing. One of the first things I read about becoming a writer was that every writer has within him 10,000 bad pages. So the best thing he could do is just start writing and getting them out of his system so he can get to the good stuff.
Yeah.
And that was me for really the next 8 years or so. I was just writing constantly, again, aware on some level that what I was writing was not great, but it was building towards something. I still tried to submit things. I submitted novels, comic book scripts, movie scripts, television scripts, just all over the place, and racked up a lot of rejection. But I kind of got used to that right away. I still have my very first rejection letter, which is from DC Comics. I pitched a series idea to them, and they said, well, thank you, but no thank you. But they sent it to me on this really cool DC stationery, which I framed and
nice.
Still have.
You probably reframe that as a screenplay. They'll shoot just about anything these days.
Oh.
All right. So as you're moving through this exercise of writing rejection,
Mm-hmm.
how did you how did you make a living as a writer during this time?
Well, for the first several years, I didn't. I was just a retail monkey who wrote on the side, and then I had sort of this back-to-back breakthrough. I was working at a music store in town, and I had just finished writing an article back at the time I was part of the cast of King Richard's Fair.
Okay.
And I thought the apprentice actor program I was part of was pretty interesting. So I wrote an article about it and sent it off to Renaissance Magazine, which focuses entirely on history and Renaissance Fair culture. And while I was waiting to hear back from that, the Falmouth Enterprise advertised an opening for a staff reporter. And I figured, okay, I've got no training in journalism, no experience. I've got one unsold magazine article to my name. What the hell? The worst they're going to say is no. I went in. I was one of 12 applicants and 3 interviews. I was the first interview, and I nailed it, apparently, because the editor called me the next day to offer me the job, and she didn't even want to interview the next 2 people. And then shortly after that, I sold the article to Renaissance Magazine. So within the space of a couple weeks, I went from 0 to 60 as a writer.
Wow. Yeah, those staff writer jobs at local papers are busy too. I mean,
Oh yeah,
yeah, you're covering not just one beat, you're probably covering everything in town, right?
I was I was covering at one time police department, fire department, the schools, a few of the smaller government departments, and then my editor realized I had a talent for making sense out of really complicated issues. And next thing you know, I'm writing about a lot of the scientific projects going on in the area, such as the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. I'm writing about county government, and next thing I know, somehow I'm the main political reporter for the newspaper, and that's was one of my big beats for the rest of my journalism career.
Wow. So I mean that's a lot of column inches over a number of years.
Oh yeah.
And I gotta imagine that even though you had sort of a sense of storytelling to begin with, that by the time you had a few years as a local reporter under your belt, you got to have developed a great sense of narrative and figuring out the placement of story elements for your creative writing. Did you find that to be helpful, or
It was, they kind of fed each other, because I remember in my interview, one of the things I said was that I viewed a news story as still a story. There was a beginning, middle, and end. There's information that had to be conveyed. I viewed writing news as writing a good story. So that helped me get going in the news industry, and then working as a reporter, that refined my storytelling techniques. It taught me the importance of word choices, because all it would take was one kind of off word choice in a story, and all of a sudden I've got angry readers calling me and yelling my brains out. It working as a reporter, it helped me speed up as a writer a lot. I write fairly tight first drafts now because I got used to writing on deadline. I didn't have a lot of time to revise.
right?
So
Edit as you go.
yeah. So yeah, having a basic foundation in storytelling helped me become a good reporter, and developing as a reporter helped me become a much better fiction writer.
So the whole time that you're working for this newspaper, are you still doing your creative writing projects on the side, or you're submitting things
Yeah, I was
outside this during this entire time?
Yep, I was still writing up screenplays, sending those out. I also started writing scripts for the Connecticut Renaissance Fair, which I'm still a part of in a different capacity, and for a group called Pastimes Entertainment. Sadly, no longer in business, but they did small little Renaissance fairs in the North Shore area. So I got a little closer to what I really wanted to be doing, being fiction storytelling, genre storytelling. So I was inching closer to where I wanted to be, and it was about 2013 when I finally made the big shift and moved completely away from news, completely into storytelling.
Was there a breakthrough in something that you had submitted for publication? What was the impetus for you to finally make that cutoff of the journalism?
Well, part of the impetus was that the paper, unfortunately, was not doing well financially. We had been in the middle of a pay freeze for several years. I was growing discontent there as a reporter, so I was looking for some kind of opportunity to draw me away from that. But the big catalyst was I gonna go back a little ways here. My young adult superhero series action figures had been brewing in my brain since high school. Some of these characters I created way back in high school, and they've been recycled and regurgitated and reimagined. And eventually they came together as the concept that became action figures. And one day I finally picked up the Hunger Games, started reading that, and I saw that young adult fiction had matured a lot.
Yeah.
You could get away with a lot more. So I figured take a shot at writing action figures as a young adult novel. I'd tried it out before as a movie, screenplay, as a television pilot script, and it didn't really ever come together. But it started to come together as a young adult novel. And once I finished the manuscript, I submitted it to countless publishers and agents. And I heard back from an agent from a rather major agency out in California, basically said, I like this concept. I think it needs to be polished up, but I want to work with you on it.
Okay.
So for about...
It's not a rejection.
No, and it was the first time since this is literally 23 years after I decided art was in the past, writing is in the future. It was the first time I'd actually had anyone say, I like this, let's try and make it work. So for 8 or 9 months, I very optimistically traded emails back and forth with this agent and polished the manuscript, sent it out to her, and the whole time I'm thinking, okay, this is it. This is when it's finally going to happen. This is the big breakthrough. And then I heard from her a couple weeks before Christmas, and she said, the manuscript's really good. I really like it. There's no market for young adult superhero fiction. I'm not going to take you on.
Oh.
Which was... I had so many rejections to that point, and they just all rolled off my back. I'd take an hour to be unhappy about it and then get right back to writing. This one derailed me for a few months.
Yeah.
Because I thought this was it. It wasn't going to happen. Maybe I was chasing the wrong dream again.
And then, you said it's 23 years since you stopped the art and to focus on the writing, but it sounds like the characters have been living in your head much longer than that at this point.
Yeah, some of them had been. A couple of the characters who show up in the series were high school creations. Others came along later. So the end product is a couple of decades or more worth of ideas and concepts that just got recycled over and over and over again until I finally found the right formula.
Right. Wow. So this is 2013?
Well, the rejection came in late 2012.
Okay.
And I had been on a writing hiatus for a while, just trying to figure out what came next. And then my friend Justin, who writes historical fiction under the pen name J.M. Aucoin, said, I've been experimenting with self-publishing. Why don't you maybe give that a try? And I'd looked into self-publishing before several years earlier, but the complexion of the self-publishing industry was a lot different then. The outfits were very predatory at times. They really wanted to soak desperate wannabe writers for a lot of money and then screw them out of royalties and rights. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the writers just weren't that good. At the paper, I'd get people who were like, oh, I just released this book. It's a published book. And then I'd realize, no, it's not a published book. It's a self-published book. And I'd start reading them, and they were terrible. So I was kind of soured on the idea, but when Justin suggested looking into it again, I found that things had changed quite a bit for the better. So I said, okay, well, I'm agent for a large California agency, thought this was good enough, but it just didn't have a market.
Right.
So that says something about the quality. So maybe this is worth a try. So I did my homework, prepped it, released it on my own in September 2013, and that's how things got going there. And it's about when I left the paper too. I had another job opportunity that I took advantage of to keep the money flowing.
Okay. So action figures was something that had been inspired in you at a younger age, largely because of your comic influences then. I mean, that seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But your other writing seems to diverge from that quite a bit. So I'm wondering where you've found the inspiration for your other published work, or even just things that you write that don't go anywhere. Where do you find the inspiration? What sparks your imagination to get the story flowing?
That's one of those questions that's always a trick question for writers, because most writers, any writer who says that they have a firm idea of where their ideas come from, I think they are kind of lying.
Okay.
I don't really understand how my brain works. Something might push me in a given direction, but I don't really have these eureka moments where I envision a new project with utter clarity. I know for The Adventures of Strongarm and Lightfoot, my fantasy series, I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons and reading some of the classics of fantasy. But what really got me going on that was the HBO adaptation of A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, had been on the air for a couple of years. And I saw that there were a lot of authors now mimicking the surface elements of the George R.R. Martin series. They were writing these grand, sprawling fantasy epics with huge, unmanageable casts,
Right.
deep political intrigue, lots of sex, lots of death, lots of language. They were just going as grim and dark and bloody as possible.
And taking themselves far too seriously in the process.
Yep. And I just kind of hit a saturation point with that. And I'm like, why can't we just have fun fantasy stories? Why does it have to be this deadly serious? So I started toying around with some ideas, and Strongarm and Lightfoot came out of that.
Yeah. I mean, I just finished the audiobook of Scratching a Lich today, and within the first, 10 or 15 minutes of listening to that, I knew I was going to finish it. I was enjoying the hell out of it. It seemed to me like, quite clearly there was a big Dungeons and Dragons influence to the story, but it seemed to me almost as if like Michael Palin was the dungeon master and you're playing Dungeons and Dragons on the set of Spamalot or something. It was just a lot of fun, and the characters are great. The story is fascinating, and it's entertaining, and it doesn't take itself too seriously. It pokes fun at itself, but also isn't silly. I mean, it deals with some pretty relevant themes. So I'm curious specifically, like how did you manage to juggle all those elements, the humor of it, but also the adultness of it?
I just kind of filtered a more or less straightforward fantasy adventure through my my rather snarky sensibilities.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't want to do anything that was outright parody or that was so wacky. I didn't want to go quite Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy level ridiculous, but I definitely wanted a lighter tone that had humorous moments in it, but didn't sacrifice character or story. And I've come to realize that if you're writing something that is more or less comedy, when you hit those dramatic moments, if you hit them too hard, it's a horrible jarring contrast. But if you hit them just right, they have a little more poignancy towards them. To them, they land a little better, because I think the humorous element helps readers connect with the story, connect with the characters a little better. One of my cardinal rules for writing is, if you want to make any character likable, even if he's the worst villain in the world, if you make him funny, readers will like him.
Mm-hmm.
So by making the entire story lighter, by giving the characters, by imbuing them with the ability to make the reader laugh, it connects the reader to them, so that when the dramatic moments hit, the readers actually give a damn.
Right. Do you have a sense for when you're approaching the line between those two things, and are able to kind of, instead of just approaching and crossing the line, to sort of to blur it a little bit as you're writing it? Or do you have to have feedback from somebody to let you know, maybe this is a little bit too jarring? How do you maintain that balance between the humor and the sensitivity that comes across in some of the characters there?
Part of it is simply the revision process. I'm sure if you looked at the first draft of Strongarm and Lightfoot, you would see moments that were rather absurd and would take you out of the story because they were so wacky, and you'd have moments that were so dark that it would take you out of the story in another direction.
Sure.
But the first draft is all about getting the ideas out of your head and onto the page, metaphorically.
Yeah. And
using the subsequent drafts to make it all work. When I write, usually I get through, depending on how tight my first draft is, I'll do 2 or 3 drafts and then send it out to test readers who will gut check me on everything.
Mm-hmm.
So, and a lot of times, my test readers will confirm something that I know in my gut, but maybe don't want to admit. There's one of the sayings among writers is "kill your babies" or "kill your darlings."
Yeah, yeah.
Because we all write something that in the moment strikes us as fantastically brilliant.
Right.
But as we develop the story, we realize, no, it doesn't work. This has to go. So fortunately, I have some good test readers who will verify for me when something does indeed have to go.
Now, when you approach the Strongarm and Lightfoot story, was the idea of the narrator, because the narrator's a character of its own in this story, and almost takes on the role, like along the theme of Dungeons and Dragons, of the dungeon master, in sort of laying out this story and only, kind of piecing out information to the reader as the DM sees fit. Was that something that you knew right off the bat? That's how you wanted to go about telling that story, or did that come along later in the process?
I had that idea in the back of my brain when I first tried to write it. I tried doing it as a fairly straightforward third-person, omniscient, neutral narrator, mm-hmm. and it wasn't working considering the tone I wanted. And I couldn't tell you where exactly the idea of doing the narrator as a character in and of himself or herself for the audiobook.
Right.
But I had this vision of someone sitting in front of a fireplace in a tavern, spinning yarns for the entertainment of the patrons. So I thought, let's give it a try and see what happens. And that's one of those minor eureka moments where I realized this is what it needed. This is what helped it come together. I know every once in a while I'll get a reader who is totally thrown off by that, and they absolutely despise the idea of the narrator being any kind of character because that's not the way it's done.
Right.
But most people, once they get what I'm doing, are totally on board.
Yeah, it took me a minute to catch on, but once I realized, how the story was going to be unfolding, I enjoyed it so much. I really thought that it not only did it help lay out the story in a way that made sense for the characters that are being presented, but it also sort of set the story apart from other fantasy novels that I've read or listened to, as the case may be. And I really found it fascinating that it was able to be, the narrator is driving the story forward, but not at the expense of the action going through the characters around who the story is centered. Yeah. I thought it was a very interesting way to go about that.
It made it more fun for me to write, and if I'm having fun writing it, then
yeah. Is that an element that you have? Because I've not had a chance to read any of your other books at this point, but is that an element unique to the Strongarm and Lightfoot series, or have you employed something similar in your other projects?
The closest I've gotten is in action figures. I write that through a first-person perspective, through the perspective of Carrie Hauser, the main character. She narrates most of the action through her point of view, and she's a bit of a snarky character. So there's a lightness to that series as well, and the fact that she's not just this sort of vague character; she's the main character.
Right.
It gives it a complexion all its own. But with Well-Behaved Women, my urban fantasy series, that's a straightforward third-person perspective narrator.
Yeah, it's okay. So Well-Behaved Women is you described that as urban fantasy, but can you explain what that is? Because I'm vaguely familiar with the premise of this, but it seems like it's something very different from what you typically find available in literature these days. So just briefly, just tell me what is this about?
Well, urban fantasy in genres is pretty popular, really. It's got a huge following, and the loose definition is it's a story set in a modern, realistic setting, but there are elements of the fantastic involved. One of the more popular examples of this is Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files series.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Yeah, because that all takes place in a modern-day Chicago in a world where magic exists and there's this entire supernatural underworld.
Right.
Technically, the TV show Supernatural could be an urban fantasy. It's a little more horror oriented, but it's got a lot of the same elements. Mm-hmm. So that's the genre for Well-Behaved Women.
And what is the story tackling with this one? Is it the same? I may have this wrong. I may have to edit this heavily. But
I'll fix it in post.
Right, exactly. I get the impression that it is sort of a recurring life of a central character?
Yeah, I don't really have an elevator pitch for Well-Behaved Women.
Okay.
I've been working on it, and the closest I'd come is Bisexuals with Swords and the League of Extraordinary Not So Gentle Women.
Okay. All right.
But the long form concept is that in this world, infamous women throughout history are reborn in the modern era, and under certain circumstances, this old soul awakens and comes to the forefront. And the main character, Rose Booker, is a police officer who was shot and almost killed in the line of duty, and after she, as she was recovering, started having dreams of what felt like an execution from a bygone era. And over the course of the story, without giving too much away, she realizes that she was in a past life the pirate queen Mary Read. So
okay.
So it kind of springboards from there, and some of the other characters are women who have also been infamous characters throughout history, and then they get sucked into this situation involving a local crime boss. Can't go into it too much more because I feel like I start spoiling stuff.
Yeah. No, but and I don't mean to ask you a trick question, but
Sure.
What was your inspiration for a story like this?
It kind of a few years ago. There's this website called Rejected Princesses, which is fantastic. Jason Porath, who's written a couple of books based on his work on the website, has found women throughout history across the world. Some you've heard of, a lot you've never heard of, and does these illustrated biographies. And I happened to come across his entry for Julie d'Aubigny, who was a 17th century French opera singer who was an absolute hellion. The most famous story involving her, she was an opera singer. She was a duelist. She was openly bisexual at a time when that was extremely scandalous. And the big story with her is she took this young woman as a lover. The woman's parents freaked out and sent the girl away to a convent to straighten out, literally and figuratively. And so Julie infiltrated the convent disguised as a nun, carried on the affair with her lover in the convent for quite some time. And then when another nun died, Julie dug up the body, put it in her girlfriend's bed, and set the convent on fire to fake her death.
Oh my.
And then they ran off, had a grand old time for a while, and then Julie just kind of got tired of her, dropped her off at her parents, and moved on to the next adventure. And that was kind of her entire life. She was constantly getting into duels with people and winning. She was France's dueling laws at the time demanded that she be executed because dueling was a problem back then. But the king thought she was just so damn entertaining, he kept pardoning her. And she was just such an amazingly fun person. I decided I had to write a story with her in it in some way.
Yeah.
But I felt like historical fiction was a little beyond my reach. So I thought, okay, how could I bring this person into the modern age in some way? And eventually it became Well-Behaved Women.
Wow. Okay. I was not expecting any historical connections there. That's really interesting. I'm definitely going to have to check out that Rejected Princesses site.
It's fantastic, and it was a big resource for me because as the series develops, it's a three book series. with a few minor exceptions. There are a few supporting characters who are made up of whole cloth. Every character in there is based on an actual person in history.
Oh, wow. So is it so far is just book one available?
Yep, book one came out last fall.
Okay.
A mutual friend of ours, Jennifer McPherson, actually. Excuse me. She was the cover model.
Yep.
For book one. Books 2 and 3, I just sent book 2 off to my editor this week, so I'm hoping to get that back by the end of March, and it should drop pretty soon thereafter. And then book 3 will drop in the fall.
Okay.
I'm doing a rapid release on that because one of the things I learned about life as an independent author is productivity leads to more success. People, the saying is, you promote your last book by writing your next book.
Right, right.
And especially with a series or a trilogy, readers want to know they're getting a complete story. So I wanted to try and get Well-Behaved Women out within the space of approximately a year.
That may go back to George R.R. Martin again, because it's been so long since he's been promising the next book in that series that he might be burning bridges for other people.
Yeah, it's sometimes I've heard it referred to as the Chinese democracy effect, referring to the Guns N' Roses album that took them like 13 years.
I don't acknowledge that album.
Yeah, no one does. It's like, yeah, you can talk about it all you want, but eventually you have to produce something and hope that it lives up to the hype.
Yeah. Okay. So there's one other thing that I wanted to ask you about and see if you've had a chance to form an opinion on this yet. The Strongarm and Lightfoot audiobook that just recently came out is the first audiobook that you've had produced. Is that right?
Second, actually.
Second,
we have an
okay.
audiobook of Well-Behaved Women.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
Have to add that to my queue. So, in your experience as a writer and a storyteller, how do you see the audiobook as compared to the actual physical written paperback or hardcover, as far as the difference in experience for the reader or the listener, but also as the author, do you experience your story differently when you listen to the audiobook version of it as opposed to when you're writing or reading initially?
It's funny. When Heather Auden, who did the narration for Strongarm and Lightfoot, started sending me her chapters, I found myself several times laughing out loud, which caught me by surprise because I wrote the damn thing. I've over the course of editing it and going back in to check things to make sure continuity between books is tight. I knew all the passages. I shouldn't be laughing at them,
right.
And yet hearing her read certain passages and nailing the comedic element, I'd laugh out loud. My wife would be sometimes on the couch while I'm listening to the submissions. She's laughing and she knows the book too. So it was kind of cool because it was like experiencing it all from a completely new perspective. It made the whole thing new for me.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I laughed out loud several times while I was listening myself, and to be able to bring something that you're so familiar with back to you in sort of a new and refreshing way, where you're able to find new humor in it. That's got to be wonderful. It
was just great listening to it, and it was sort of a happy accident. It even happened because I met Heather doing the Connecticut Renaissance Fair in 2017, and over the course of the production, we talked about what we do outside of the show. I mentioned I was a writer. She mentioned she did audiobook narration, and I was already planning to do an audiobook version for Well-Behaved Women. I knew that from the get-go.
Yeah.
And I told her, when it's ready, I'll let you know and you can do the audition. And she read for Well-Behaved Women, and she did a great job, and she really nailed some of the accents, because there's a wide variety of accents that show up over the course of this series. But I also got a woman by the name of Darcy Cole, who also did an excellent job, and her reading it felt like a better fit for Well-Behaved Women. But I still wanted to use Heather for something because she did such a great job. And kind of on a whim, I thought, okay, I'll see if she's interested in maybe doing something with Strongarm and Lightfoot. Yeah. And I hadn't thought about doing it as an audiobook before, but I had this opportunity, figured I'd take a shot. I sent her some sample pages. She read it, and it was fantastic. And I'm like, okay, you want to do this with me? She said, yep, and the rest is history.
Yeah. It's really amazing, like, with an audiobook, finding the right person to read it can make all the difference. I listened to a ton of them, and some of them are books that I've read a number of times. Yeah. And I've always enjoyed it, but I just can't listen to the audio because I just don't enjoy the reader. It's a big decision.
It is. It's I've been doing Renaissance fairs for 20 plus years now, and I've sat in on audition processes from a director's standpoint. I'm the Connecticut Renaissance Fair's fight director, so I'm there with the main scenario director, watching people do their monologues, read from sides. It's kind of awkward being in that position. I feel I'm there to be judgmental. But it was also educational because working with someone, my friend Scott Kegler, who's the director, I'm sponging information off of him when he's not looking, but just watching how he works with auditioning actors and talks about what he's looking for a given role.
Yeah,
it proved helpful when it came time to audition audiobook narrators.
Oh, I'll bet, yeah. Okay, so you've got Well-Behaved Women, Strongarm and Lightfoot, action figures, and you also have a new short story available?
Yep. I'm a member of the New England Speculative Writers Group, which is it's only a few years old, but it's developed really, really well in that time. It's for anyone who in the New England area who writes fantasy, science fiction, other kinds of speculative fiction. Doesn't matter if you're not a professional. If you're just someone who's working on their first novel, it's a great group to get involved with. They're online. They're on Facebook. You can hunt them down, join the group. Great resource. But I can't remember if it was last year or the year before. It's been a project quite a while in the making. One of the founders decided that he was going to try putting together an anthology. The New England Horror Writers Group puts out one every couple of years, and they do really well. So I think he was drawing on that for inspiration. So the anthology is called The Final Summons, and when they started putting this together, that was the only thing any writer had to work on. They were given the concept of the final summons, interpret that as you will.
Ah, I see.
So we got to just take that in whatever direction we felt like taking it. I submitted a story. It's a story set in the Strongarm and Lightfoot universe, but it doesn't feature any of the characters from the series. It's sort of a side story.
Okay. All right.
Tonally a little different too. It's more of a straightforward narrative. It doesn't use the the affable narrator character.
Okay.
But it was one of 14 stories chosen for the anthology. So this is my first anthology, hopefully not my last, and it came out on February 14th, I think.
Okay.
Last week. I actually have my nice hardcover copy here on the table in front of me. But my story is The Going Rate for Penance, which is set in the Strongarm Lightfoot world, but features different characters. It's right in the middle of the book, so I've got some prime real estate.
Nice. Okay, so where can people find? I mean, I know Well-Behaved Women and Strongarm and Lightfoot Scratching a Lich are both available on Audible and therefore on Amazon. What about action figures or the Final Summons?
People can find all of my books, including the Final Summons, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, I believe. The Final Summons is also on iTunes. iTunes also sells ebooks, which I only learned fairly recently.
I learned that a matter of seconds ago.
Yeah. And every one of my books is also available on my website. There are a lot of people who just don't like to give money to Amazon in particular, so
Sure.
they can buy print versions or ebook versions through me directly through my website. If they buy a print version through the website, I'll sign it to them. I'll sign it and send it out. The Final Summons is the only one that's not available through my website.
Okay, and what is the website?
The website is innsmouthlook.com, and I'll spell that out because not everyone's a Lovecraft fan. If you're a Lovecraft fan, you're going to get the reference. INNSMOUTHLOOK.com.
Okay, I'll make sure that's in the show notes too, so people can just click the
Cool.
link. And what about on social media? Are you on any social pages people can follow you?
Oh yeah, I'm all over the place. If people go to the website and look under the About Mike section, they'll find all my social media links. They can also find a link for signing up for my weekly newsletter. They can follow the blog, so and get weekly updates there. I'm pretty all over the place. If people want to just stick to my writing stuff, the website, the newsletter, Facebook, probably the best bets. Other things get a little more. I get a little political on Twitter. I post silly stuff on Instagram. So depending on what people want out of me, there are options.
All right. And the last thing I always like to do with everybody before I release you back into the world is to get a recommendation for anything that you've experienced recently that you like to have other people try for the first time, if maybe they haven't. Could be anything. It could be a restaurant or a book or music you've heard recently or anything. And take your time.
That's a tricky one. I've got a whole mess of stuff just kind of around. Okay, first thing that caught my eye I've kind of given up on video games. I'm really big into board games and card games now.
Okay.
And for Christmas, my wife got me the board game The Thing: Infection at Outpost 31, which is based on the John Carpenter movie. It's you get to play all 12 characters from the film, including McCree, Kurt Russell's character, which of course I play at every given opportunity. You're searching the base, trying to find the thing, trying not to get infected. It's a great group game. Played it a few times. I got to try it out at a gaming cafe in New York City. Fell in love with it. Finally got my own copy. Played it a few times. It's a blast. It's a 48-person game. It's a little on the pricey side, but not as much as some board games out there.
Yeah. Board games have gotten very expensive recently.
But I find I'm happier dropping that kind of money on a board game than on a PlayStation game.
Yeah.
I like the social aspect of board gaming.
Yeah, I've found myself doing the same thing recently. No, that's good. That's a great one. I haven't heard of that one before. I might have to check that out myself. How are you feeling right now?
Pretty good. Pretty good.
All right, I'll take pretty good. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for doing this. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you again to Michael for coming on the pod. Now make sure to check out his work at innsmouthlook.com. That's INNSMOUTHLOOK.com, where you can see all of his stuff, and you can order signed copies of any of his novels. And honestly, I cannot recommend highly enough that you listen to Heather's reading of Strongarm and Lightfoot, Scratching a Lich on Audible. It is so much fun and a great listen. So here is your reminder to leave a rating or review of the pod on iTunes. And if iTunes isn't your thing, ratings and reviews can now be left on 2 non-Apple related services, Radio Public and Podknife. So if you're listening on an Android device or on your computer, feel free to drop your 2 cents on those platforms. And of course, if you'd like to support the pod more, you can visit tabletostagepod.com to see the latest merch, or patreon.com/tabletostage to get behind-the-scenes content, advance access to all episodes, and discounts on all merch. Seriously, check it out. That's it for this week. Until next time, keep creating.